9 a.m., February 21, 2026, inside Department 14 of the Stanley Mosk Courthouse in Los Angeles. The atmosphere was tense as a preliminary ruling was delivered in a high-profile civil dispute between Netflix and Archewell Productions. The case, filed under number 25-STC-V001, centers on allegations of breach of contract tied to the Sussex's multi-year production agreement. According to court documents reviewed this morning, the judge granted Netflix's motion for partial summary judgment. In practical terms, that means the streaming giant has cleared a significant legal hurdle in its effort to recover funds it claims were paid without the agreed level of content delivery. The ruling does not end the case, but it sharply narrows the defense options available to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Prince Harry appeared via secure video link from a reported location in Portugal. Meghan Markle was not physically present in court and was represented by counsel. Observers described the hearing as procedural, but consequential, with the judge emphasizing that the dispute is contractual in nature and will be decided on documented evidence, rather than public reputation. At the heart of the lawsuit is a reported $100 million production agreement signed in 2020 between Netflix and Archewell between September 2020 and January 2025. Filings indicate that more than $40 million in advances and milestone payments were distributed. In exchange, Netflix received several documentary-style projects, including the series Harry and Meghan and Heart of However, the company alleges that multiple promised scripted productions were never completed or meaningfully developed. The judge's ruling, references what was described as a material gap between payment and performance. According to the court's preliminary findings, Netflix presented internal communications and production logs, suggesting that key milestones tied to development funding were not met. Archewell's legal team argued that pandemic-related delays and creative restructuring impacted delivery time, but the court determined that those factors alone do not invalidate contractual obligations. One significant outcome of today's decision is the authorization of a financial monitoring order. Under what is labeled Order 402, a court-appointed receiver may begin reviewing specific accounts tied to the disputed funds. This does not equate to a seizure of assets at this stage, but it signals heightened judicial oversight while the case proceeds. Additionally, Netflix's legal filing alleges that a portion of production advances was redirected into affiliated holding entities. Archewell's representatives have not publicly commented on those allegations, and no criminal charges have been filed. The matter remains a civil dispute focused on contract enforcement. Industry analysts note that this case could carry broader implications for celebrity production deals signed during the streaming boom of 2020 and 2021. At that time, platforms were aggressively securing exclusive partnerships with high-profile figures as part of what media strategists called brand capture. If the court ultimately rules in Netflix's favor, it may reset expectations for accountability in high-value entertainment contracts. For now, the Sussex legal team has 30 days to present a formal response, outlining either a repayment framework or grounds for reconsideration. The court made clear that failure to provide verifiable financial documentation could accelerate enforcement measures. What began as a headline-grabbing partnership between royalty and Hollywood has now entered a formal phase of financial scrutiny. The outcome remains uncertain, but one point was unmistakable in today's courtroom: celebrity status carries no weight in contract law. Following the court's preliminary ruling, attention has shifted to the financial details outlined in the filings. According to Netflix's legal team, the dispute centers not only on missed production milestones, but also on the structure of payments made between 2020 and 2024. The company argues that advances were tied to clearly defined development phases, including scripting, pre-production, planning, and scheduled release timelines. Court records indicate that while several documentary projects were delivered, at least 2 scripted concepts did not progress beyond early-stage development. Netflix maintains that under the terms of the agreement, failure to meet specific creative benchmarks triggers repayment clauses. Archewell's attorneys countered that the contract allowed for flexible timelines and evolving content strategy, particularly during the global production shutdowns caused by COVID-19. Legal analysts observing the case note that much of the argument hinges on how commercially reasonable efforts are defined within the agreement. That phrase, common in entertainment contracts, can carry broad interpretation. Netflix asserts that commercially reasonable efforts require demonstrable progress backed by budgets, staffing, and production schedules. Archewell's position suggests that strategic pivots and market recalibrations fall within acceptable creative discretion. Another element introduced during proceedings involves internal correspondence presented by Netflix. According to court summaries, the streaming platform submitted emails and budget forecasts indicating concern over development stagnation as early as mid-2023. While the contents of those communications have not been publicly released in full, The judge acknowledged they appear to show repeated requests for updated production timelines. Legal team has argued that certain documents lack full context and that confidential negotiations were ongoing behind the scenes. They have requested additional time to submit financial reconciliation data, including third-party expense audits. The court granted limited time for supplemental filings but declined to delay enforcement. Preparations tied to Order 402. Meanwhile, media industry observers are closely monitoring the reputational dimension of the case. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle entered the streaming landscape with significant global visibility. Their debut docuseries attracted high initial viewership numbers, according to publicly reported platform data. However, analysts say the broader question is sustainability. High-value deals signed during the competitive streaming expansion era are now facing stricter performance reviews as companies prioritize profitability. The case has also sparked discussion about risk allocation in celebrity partnerships. Entertainment attorneys note that large upfront advances are typically balanced by stringent accountability measures. If repayment clauses are activated, it could reinforce a trend toward milestone-based compensation, rather than lump sum guarantees in future contracts. Outside the courtroom, neither Prince Harry nor Meghan Markle has issued a direct statement regarding the ruling. Representatives have reiterated that they remain committed to storytelling projects aligned with their foundation's mission. Netflix has declined to comment beyond its formal filings, citing ongoing litigation. The next procedural milestone will involve submission of detailed financial records and a hearing to assess potential restitution pathways. If mediation fails, the case could proceed to full trial later this year. For now, the legal focus remains narrow: whether contractual performance standards were met. The broader public narrative may continue to evolve, but within the courtroom, the dispute is defined by documentation, delivery, benchmarks, and financial accountability. As proceedings move forward, the scope of the dispute is widening beyond missed deadlines to questions about financial allocation. During yesterday's hearing, NETFLIX's legal representatives introduced a forensic accounting summary that tracks approximately $40 million in advances distributed over multiple payment phases. The company alleges that a portion of those funds cannot yet be directly linked to documented production expenditures. According to the filing, several payments were routed through affiliated entities registered in Delaware. Netflix argues that while such structures are not inherently improper, they require transparent accounting when tied to production budgets. The judge emphasized that the case remains civil in nature and that no criminal determination has been made. However, the court did authorize expanded financial disclosure to clarify how development funds were applied. Attorneys responded by stating that production accounting in entertainment ventures often involves layered corporate structures, including holding companies and consulting agreements. They maintain that all expenditures were consistent with industry standards and that additional documentation will demonstrate legitimate business use. The defense has requested the opportunity to submit audited expense reports within the 30-day window established by the court. One notable component of the hearing involved discussion of a cross-default clause reportedly embedded within the original agreement. Legal analysts explain that such clauses can allow one contractual breach to affect obligations in related deals. While no additional lawsuits have been filed, industry observers suggest that the outcome of this case could influence other commercial relationships tied to the Sussex brand. The court also addressed allegations regarding development of the animated series Pearl, which was publicly announced but later canceled. Netflix contends that several $1 million allocated for early-stage production yielded no completed animation work. Archewell's legal team argues that creative projects can be shelved during conceptual refinement and that early development costs do not automatically equate to breach. Beyond the financial technicalities, the case reflects a broader recalibration within the streaming industry. During the expansion phase of 2020 to 2021, companies competed aggressively for exclusive talent partnerships. As profitability pressures increased in subsequent years, platforms shifted toward stricter oversight of deliverables. Media economists note that this lawsuit may serve as a test case for how those early high-value contracts are ultimately enforced. Meanwhile, attention has turned to potential settlement scenarios. Court observers indicate that mediation remains a viable path if both parties can agree on a structured repayment or revised content arrangement. However, neither side has publicly confirmed active settlement talks. The judge has signaled a preference for resolution outside a protracted trial, but made clear that enforcement mechanisms are ready if compliance is not demonstrated. In parallel, public reaction has been mixed. Some commentators frame the dispute as a routine contract enforcement matter, while others view it as symbolic of the challenges celebrities face when transitioning into corporate production roles. Legal experts caution that reputation alone carries limited influence in a courtroom focused on documentation. The next scheduled hearing will review the submitted financial disclosures and determine whether restitution discussions should proceed or whether the case will advance toward trial. Until then, the dispute remains defined by contractual interpretation, fiscal transparency, and the evidentiary record now under judicial review. As the legal process advances, attention is increasingly focused on the potential financial consequences if the court ultimately rules in Netflix's favor. Under California contract law, a finding of material breach can authorize repayment of advances tied to undelivered work, along with possible interest and legal fees. However, such outcomes typically depend on detailed financial reconciliation rather than headline figures alone. During the latest hearing, the judge reiterated that the court's role is to determine whether contractual obligations were fulfilled, not to evaluate public narratives or media speculation. Both parties have now been directed to prepare comprehensive accounting statements. For Netflix, that includes a breakdown of milestone payments and expected deliverables. For Archewell, it involves substantiating how funds were allocated across development, staffing, marketing, and overhead. Legal experts say the most immediate risk for the Sussexes is not a sudden asset seizure but structured financial oversight. If discrepancies remain unresolved, the court could expand the authority of the appointed receiver to monitor specific accounts related to the disputed agreement. Such measures are common in high-value commercial disputes where repayment claims exceed 8 figures. Another key question involves the long-term business impact. Industry analysts note that unresolved litigation can influence negotiations with other partners. While no evidence has been presented in court suggesting additional claims from other companies, the existence of a high-profile lawsuit can introduce caution among potential collaborators. Entertainment contracts often include morality or material adverse change clauses. Though activation depends on specific circumstances, Archewell's representatives have maintained that they remain committed to producing meaningful content and dispute the characterization that projects were abandoned. In prior public statements unrelated to this case, the couple emphasized a focus on documentary storytelling and socially driven narratives. Whether that creative direction aligns with the original Netflix agreement is central to the legal dispute. Meanwhile, observers in the United Kingdom have also taken note of the case. King Charles III and Buckingham Palace have not issued statements regarding the proceedings. Royal analysts suggest that the silence reflects a long-standing policy of non-intervention in private commercial matters involving non-working members of the royal family. The court filings themselves make no reference to royal institutions, focusing exclusively on corporate obligations. From a procedural standpoint, the next phase will determine whether mediation can produce a settlement framework, structured repayment plans, revised content commitments, or mutual contract termination are all theoretically possible outcomes. A full trial, if pursued, could extend well into the following year and involve sworn testimony, financial audits, and cross-examination of executives. For now, the legal landscape remains fluid. The judge's preliminary ruling has strengthened Netflix's position, but final liability has not been determined. Both sides face reputational considerations alongside financial stakes. Yet the courtroom process remains grounded in documentation and contract language. As the 30-day compliance window progresses, the central issue remains unchanged: whether the financial advances paid under a landmark streaming deal were matched by measurable production performance. The answer to that question will ultimately shape the resolution of one of the entertainment industry's most closely watched contract disputes. By late afternoon, on February 21, 2026, the immediate legal shock had settled into procedural reality. The preliminary ruling marked a significant development, but it did not conclude the dispute. Instead, it initiated a defined countdown: 30 days for financial clarification, structured response, and potential negotiation. At 4 p.m., court officials confirmed that both parties had received formal instructions regarding disclosure requirements. Netflix must itemize the exact damages it seeks to recover. Archewell must provide verifiable documentation demonstrating how advances were spent and what development work was completed. Failure to comply could result in expanded judicial oversight or enforcement measures. Legal commentators emphasize that high-value contract disputes of this scale rarely end in dramatic fashion. More often, they conclude through settlement agreements negotiated behind closed doors. A structured repayment schedule, revised content obligations, or mutual termination of the partnership remain possible outcomes. However, if negotiations stall, the case could proceed to full trial, placing executives and producers under oath. The broader implications extend beyond this single agreement. Streaming platforms are increasingly reassessing the risk models that defined the expansion era of 2020 and 2021. Performance metrics, milestone verification, and tighter release conditions are now standard practice. Industry insiders suggest this case may reinforce that shift toward accountability-driven contracts. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the matter now centers on financial transparency and legal compliance rather than public perception. No criminal findings have been made, and the dispute remains a civil matter. Still, the reputational stakes are considerable given the visibility of the parties involved. As the compliance deadline approaches, one fact is clear: the courtroom has replaced the red carpet. The next chapter will not be written in press releases or interviews, but in filings, audits, and judicial orders. The outcome will depend not on celebrity status, but on documentation and whether the numbers ultimately align.